Thank you. As Suzanne says, I'm a professor of Christian origins, actually, at New College, which basically means New Testament. My interests are in the Gospels, the historical Jesus, and particularly the social political world of Judea in the first century, and Galilee. So I'm interested in very much social history. What were the times like? Who did what? What did Pontius Pilate smell like? Did the disciples have lice? You know, all of these things are things that I'm interested in, the nitty-gritty of it all. And so besides being an academic, I've also done a lot of work for television companies. Over the last 20 years, I've been involved in more than 50 documentaries. And so I've never done a passion play at all. I have no experience in passion plays. But I have done a lot of documentaries and also dramas on TV. And those of you who've watched documentaries nowadays will know that there's actually not much difference between a documentary and a drama in historical things, because they always want to have a kind of dramatization. They'll have a talking head and then they'll go to the dramatization. So drama and what people look like, what they were doing, the interactions between them is very much part of a documentary just as much as a drama. So just a few things that I was involved with. History Channel's The Bible from 2013. This went out in Channel 5 over here. 10-part dramatization of the Bible, 5 parts on the Old Testament, 5 on the New, and they really most of the attention was on the life of Jesus and the death of Jesus. So I was historical advisor for the New Testament section, particularly the death of Jesus. Another one I did a couple of years ago with Hugh Bonneville as the presenter was called Countdown to Calvary. The idea was to start a week before Palm Sunday. There's a clock ticking backwards as we kind of get to the death of Jesus. And the sort of the idea was what's happening 3 days before, 2 days before, 1 day before, and clock going and lots of sort of CCTV watching. The idea was to get over that idea of state, the Roman state watching. That was put together by RTE, the Irish television radio company, with European help as well. It went out nearly everywhere in the world apart from the UK, because all of the British channels decided that people don't want documentaries or things about Jesus, even at Easter, sadly. Which says something interesting, I think, about certainly our TV and radio people's idea of what people want. Another thing I did, I just thought I'd mention this. It's not a passion play. Obviously, it's about the Nativity of Jesus. This was done by the BBC in 2010, and it was written by Tony Jordan, who did Brookside and Hustle and Life on Mars and loads of things that I really, really like. So I was quite in awe when I met him. And it went out kind of like a soap 4 days before Christmas, and I thought it was beautifully done. And I mention it because of the particular difficulty that I'm going to talk about in a moment of having 2 very different accounts of something and trying to kind of splice them together. So, I want to talk about challenges, first of all. I will have something slightly more optimistic at the end, and then I'll pass over to my colleague Jolyon Mitchell, who is always optimistic, so he can say some more positive things. I want to mention 3 of the challenges that I think we have whenever we try to put sort of biblical stories in drama form, and particularly something like the Passion narratives. And the first thing is just the differences between the accounts. So just to go through them very quickly, Mark's Gospel, probably the earliest to be written, has a very strong sense of self-denial and a slave's death. The main thing of his teaching is self-denial. Put yourself last, and the first will be last. Deny yourself. Lay down your life. And so Jesus dies in Mark's Gospel a slave's death. It's a miserable, horrible end in Mark's gospel. He's entirely alone. Even that final saying, my God, why have you deserted me? Everybody has gone. And of course, later on you find that there were actually some women. But as far as Mark's concerned, the whole picture is Jesus dies this horrible, miserable end, a slave's death on the cross, with a cry of agony, even apparently God deserting him at the end. So Mark then forms the basis of all the other Gospels. Matthew's Gospel is very interesting because Matthew seems to have been written in a context in which there's a great deal of hostility between Mark's particular Christian group and the wider synagogue community. Matthew is very Jewish. He's always quoting the Old Testament, always showing how things are fulfilled in Jesus. But at the same time, he's extremely anti-Jewish. And that's what makes people think that he's in this sort of difficult situation, a Jewish Christian church that's now withdrawing from the synagogue. And so the theme of guilt runs throughout Matthew's passion narrative. Who's responsible? Who killed Jesus? Whose fault is it? Matthew is the only gospel to have Pilate's wife in it, with the dream she has, and then she, of course, tells Pilate to have nothing to do with Jesus. This is also the only gospel in which Pilate washes his hands, and the infamous cry of the Jews, the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, Matthew says, when they say, his blood be on us and on our children. Luke's gospel, different again. Luke wants to show that Christianity is perfectly compatible with the Roman state. So he's very keen to show that Jesus hasn't committed any crimes to underline Jesus' innocence. And so he has a more formal trial. He has specific charges. In this gospel, Pilate 3 times declares Jesus innocent. He says, I find no crime in this man. 3 times. And Luke is the only one to have a trial in front of Herod Antipas. And the whole point of that seems to be that he has 2 high-status male witnesses who both say Jesus is innocent. And so that really underlines that idea that for Luke, Jesus has committed no crime. And then John is different again. For John, the cross is not this miserable, pitiable end, but the supreme moment of glorification of the Son of God. It's the moment when people see Jesus' glory. Whereas for the other Gospels, crucifixion is a horrible thing that needs the resurrection to sort of redeem it, to make it all right again. For John, the resurrection, the cross and the resurrection and the ascension are all rolled into one thing. All of which show Jesus' glory. So he keeps talking about Jesus being lifted up, and this is the means by which people see the Father's glory. This is the only gospel where Jesus' mother and the beloved disciple are there. Jesus puts them into each other's care, and then he dies with the words, it is finished. He's perfectly in control. It's a kind of a majestic Jesus. So we have 4 very different accounts. The question is, what do you do with them? Do you just dramatize one version? And for example, Pasolini's film on Matthew, that has its own integrity. You can just follow the Matthean text, and you've got one story. There's a thing called the Lumo Project you might have heard about, which is a dramatization of each of the Gospels. And then it's just done as a drama with no speaking. And then the idea is that you can read the biblical text as a voiceover, and that works in any language. But they're done in specific Gospels. So again, when you do that, you keep the integrity of the original account. And when I did the Nativity that I was showing you the slides for a while ago, the first time I met with Tony Jordan and the producer, I came with all these ideas about how about just dramatising Matthew's birth story, or how about just dramatising Luke's birth story, because they're both very different. Matthew is full of Herod and kings and wise men from the east and gifts. Luke, on the other hand, is full of shepherds and no room at the inn and angels. And I said, it's really difficult to put them both together. Why not do one or the other? And the producer just looked at me and said, after a moment's pause, he said, they are all part of the modern story of the Passion of the Nativity, and we are going to have them all. We're going to have magi and shepherds. and I felt a bit deflated, but as I thought about it, I thought he's probably right. This is the modern story, and like it or not, we have to kind of think of some way to put them all together. So most people, I think, if you ask them what is the gospel account of Jesus' death, it's something like this. Jesus is arrested, brief interview before the high priest, longer trial before the Jewish council, condemned of blasphemy, passed to Pontius Pilate, sent to Herod Antipas. Pilate washes his hands, the people cry out, his blood be on us and on our children. Pilate sends Jesus to the cross. And that's it. But it is interesting to note that a lot of these things are only in one gospel. So brief interview before the high priest, only in John. Longer trial, that Sanhedrin trial, is only in Matthew and Mark, not in Luke, not in John. Condemnation of blasphemy, again, only in Mark and Matthew, not the others. Herod Antipas, only in Luke. Pilate washing his hands and the cry of the people only in Matthew. So we have to be aware that stories that had their own integrity in their own gospel, somehow when you kind of splice them all together and make this harmonized picture, they no longer quite have that integrity. And you end up with, particularly in the character of Pilate, somebody who really does seem to be running from one thing to another. And I think it's quite difficult to make that sort of psychologically realistic. There's not a great deal of psychological realism in the Gospels themselves, but when you have this kind of harmonized picture, I think it becomes even harder. So the first challenge, I think, is the differences in the text. Which are you going to go with? How are you going to do it? Second challenge is simply the brevity of the accounts. If you just read out the Gospel accounts, it wouldn't last for very long, particularly if you're just doing the Passion narrative. If you're just doing from Jesus' arrest or even the Last Supper, you'd be lucky to eke it out to half an hour or so if you just take the biblical accounts. And that's largely where historical consultants like me come in. Nobody is really asking me to look at the gospel text and say, did it happen or did it not? That's not what they're interested in. Just like the Nativity, they want it all in there. This is our modern idea of what the Passion is all about. So the role of a historical consultant in these things is really to give more padding, to give more authentic detail, to make the things smell like the first century, if that's what you're after. Of course, I mean, in the case of Passion plays, you may want to do it in a completely different way. You might want to update it completely. But certainly in terms of the kind of things I've been involved in, the interest was in situating it in the first century, making people believe that it could have happened like that. And so, of course, in the case of someone like Pontius Pilate, it's not just a question of having the trial in front of Pilate. What historical consultants are really expected to do is provide lots of other stories. What kind of man was Pilate? What else do we know about him? And so, for example, in the History Channel's The Bible, what they would do is kind of splice a story about Pilate from the Gospel with another account of something that happened in the governorship of Pilate. So you might see some kind of a riot happening because of something that Pilate did. And that would be a genuine historical incident, something that we know of from the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who gives us a very full count of the first century. Again, we know a lot about what the temple looked like, about what the high priests were doing at the time. If anyone doesn't know, this is a bone box from the 1st century, and this particular one is thought to have had the remains of Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, in it. You can just about see his name in Aramaic there on the side. So the point of the historical consultants then is to add more material. In my case, genuine sort of 1st century material that can then sort of bulk up the picture that we get from the gospel. And of course, I suppose part of what it's doing too is to make it seem like a genuine historical thing. You're adding these kind of historical details. Just on details, clothing, I think, is a complete lost cause. There is no way that anybody is going to change their mental picture of Jesus, especially if it's in the 1st century. I mean, since the Middle Ages, it has been absolutely decided and decreed, laid down in the Shroud of Turin, that Jesus has this long hair and the beard and the Bedouin look. I mean, that is, for everybody, that is what Jesus looked like. Doesn't matter that Roman people look like this. Doesn't matter that the emperors of the time, Augustus, Tiberius, were all had short hair, clean shaven. That was the look. And I'm not suggesting that people in Galilee were dedicated followers of fashion, but that was broadly what people looked like. Also, short tunics. I mean, who would walk around like that? If you're a fisherman or a carpenter, you know, that is far more practical. That's what people look like. But I think it's just a lost cause to try and persuade anybody. And the third challenge, of course, is the anti-Jewishness of the texts. I've already mentioned that in the terms of Matthew. Mel Gibson, bless him, with his The Passion of the Christ. I mean, the big thing there was the anti-Jewishness of the text. And the thing was, though, that he was just following the texts themselves. And the problem is that we read these texts in little bits and pieces, and it's only when you see the whole thing that, particularly those bits from Matthew, that you're suddenly confronted with just how anti-Jewish some of these texts are. And I think that's very difficult. And it's not anti-Semitic, it's not against Jews as an ethnic race, but the Christian Gospels are written at a time when Christianity and Judaism are going their separate ways. There's a lot of hostility. Christians are also the small group against the dominant Jewish community. And of course, those texts read very differently when Christians are now in the sort of the larger group. So that's always a difficulty. In Mel Gibson's case, of course, he just left it in Aramaic, where the Jews say, "His blood be on us and on our children." And I don't think there was a subtitle for that bit, but, you know, it's still there. So just very briefly at the end, opportunities. I've talked about challenges there. One of the opportunities, I think, is already in the Gospels themselves, and that's that they're all changing the basic story to fit in with their own times, their own interests, the interests of their own communities. That when at the start I was looking at the differences in terms of the Passion narratives, they're all written for their own particular communities with their own particular interests. And that continues into what's known as non-canonical literature. So this is basically perfectly orthodox Christian writing that simply didn't make it into the New Testament. Oh, I did do a little bit of changing this on the train, but I couldn't get it to show up. So Acts of Pilate, for example, is it's an account of the trial scene. It's from about the 4th, 5th century, but it's an account, a very detailed account of Jesus' trial in front of Pilate. It's clearly kind of far away from the realms of history. Jesus comes into the courtroom, and all of the Roman standards that are being held by the Roman soldiers all bow to the ground. And there's all kinds of sort of wacky, miraculous things. But it's interesting, again, that it's yet another account of the trial of Jesus. All sorts of people that Jesus has been healing come and give their testimony. And then at some point, the Acts of Pilate, the story of the trial, gets interwoven in another gospel called the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is the one that has Jesus going down to hell, the harrowing of hell, opening the gates of hell and allowing all the people out, which is sort of slightly alluded to perhaps in Matthew's gospel with that story of the dead people coming out of the tombs. There's a whole slew of letters of Pontius Pilate to various emperors saying, guess what happened in my court today? I met this man and he was really amazing and I think I might be a Christian myself. So again, you know, a whole kind of body of literature there. Also the Gospel of Peter, which is a fragmentary 2nd century gospel, which just tells of the passion narrative, and also goes into the resurrection story and has people actually watching the resurrection. The stone is rolled away and 2 very big people come out, angelic figures, and one is huge and his head goes up to the sky, and that's Jesus, who walks out and he's followed by a walking, talking cross. So again, kind of interesting speculative stuff, but I think just shows the fact that reinterpreting the stories carried on, and then of course into the Middle Ages and Passion plays themselves. So I think already from the Bible itself, from the New Testament, you have this authorization to carry on reinterpreting. That's what that fourfold gospel does. It's a bit of a shame, I always think, that the canon took place. I mean, it's a shame really that we have such a division between books considered canonical and everything else that was written by Christians from the 1st, 2nd century onwards. I think there's lots of material in those later gospels that can actually provide ideas, inspiration, and much of it is very, very early, 2nd, 3rd century. This is not that much later than the canonical Gospels themselves.